Hello and welcome to another episode of The Living Philosophy. Today I want to talk about the style of JRR Tolkien. So I'm just after finishing The Lord of the Rings last week, and before that I was reading the Silmarillion and the Hobbit, and just first time revisiting them in about a decade, and I guess just reading into it, there's something curious about Tolkien's style. Now there's a letter at the start of the newer version of the Silmarillion that Tolkien wrote to his editor way back when The Lord of the Rings was getting published, and he felt that the Silmarillion should be published at the same time to give the kind of the fleshing out of the world, because the Silmarillion is the history of Middle-earth. It's the history of the First Age and the Second Age, with Lord of the Rings taking place towards the end of the Third Age, and it provides very interesting back history. But to hear him talk about what he's trying to do with Middle-earth, with the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, Tolkien is quite often thrown into the genre of fantasy, maybe because he was almost the pioneer of the genre, but that's not what he was trying to do, funnily enough, in his own reckoning. Now, Peter Jackson did a great interview on this, and there's a great clip where he talks about that Tolkien was this, he's this Oxford professor of history and linguistics and philology, and his concern is not with writing just like a mere fantasy book. See, Tolkien saw this problem, he saw this as a problem anyway, so he saw this problem that England had no mythology of its own. So it kind of lost everything because the Celtic traditions were oral and they got wiped out. So you've got like the Welsh have their cycle of myths, and so do the Scots and the Irish and obviously the Greeks and the Romans, but the English didn't really have that, and so Tolkien kind of wanted to create that himself. He wanted to create an entire mythology, a historical mythology of England. And so what he was doing wasn't writing fantasy, he was doing something much more audacious. He was trying to create a mythology for a people, which is strange. It's hard to even conceive what exactly that means, because would people have believed it? But I suppose I don't believe in Cuchulainn or Finn McCool in the sense of the myths that are told about them, or the different beings that existed allegedly then. So I guess it's creating that mythological world that creates a prehistory rather than something that's to be believed literally. But it's just a very interesting point, and it kind of contextualizes a lot of other things that Tolkien sometimes get criticized for, especially like his style. So if you look at the Silmarillion, gets a really bad rap. Even Lord of the Rings, particularly Section 2 of the Two Towers, gets a bad rap for how it's written, for the stylistic style of his Middle-earth writings. But once you have this little bit in mind, it kind of slots things into place, because he's not trying to write something that's entertaining. He's not trying to write something to regale the crowds with constant enjoyment. He's writing something very noble, something very high. He's trying to create a mythology for a people. And so if you look at a lot of mythology, the Book of Kings in the Bible, there's actually Leviticus, Deuteronomy, there's so many books in the Bible that are just terribly boring, but they're foundational to creating that world, to recording that world. So you get long chapters of this guy was the son of this guy was the son of this guy, and I'll never forget reading about the temple, and this side was 2 cubits by 4 cubits, and it's just terribly boring. But it's purposefully boring. It's not intentionally boring or anything, but it's written in a certain style because it's trying to convey a certain thing. It's got a lofty ideal, and the ideal isn't entertainment, as you might say is the goal with a fantasy novel. So he's trying to create something very ambitious, and because he's doing that requires different styles. So he uses the annalistic kind of turgid and objective-y kind of style, very like historical writings, and he uses that a lot more in Silmarillion. It's much more objective and factual and distant in some way. And whereas if you read The Hobbit is very close, it's very intimate, and it's very warm. It's much more like a typical fantasy novel. Obviously that was a children's book that he wrote, but it's so much more, because his intention was different with that. This is a subsection within this world. Then you get this, you can see that he's capable of writing something that's very warm and very close. And The Lord of the Rings is, again, different to The Hobbit. It's somewhere between The Hobbit and the Silmarillion. It is the story of the world, but it's because it's coming to the peak. It's still tied in with all those noble themes because it's central to the story, whereas The Hobbit can afford to be somewhat whimsical because it's a peripheral story in some sense. And there's something else as well. It's that there's no lewdness, or there isn't the lower brow humanistic elements that we see in other fantasy stories. Like Game of Thrones has it shows very much like the dark sides of humanity, and it's much more accurate psychologically than The Lord of the Rings. But The Lord of the Rings, again, it's more mythological, which is to say it's a different type of world. It's a world where there are good things and evil things. Like, there is nothing in the world, there's no person in the world that is Sauron, that is Morgoth, that is purely evil. They're caricatures in some sense. It's not psychologically real for them to be individuals. But if you look at it as the landscape of cultural psyche, then it makes sense. The Sauron is the evil that is within us all. Same with the Morgoth, and the Aragorn is the heroic aspect in us, and the Frodo or the Bilbo is the homely, or the Sam is probably the best example of this, the homely hero, the one who both does and doesn't want to go on the journey and probably prefers their home hearth to the open road. But these are all aspects in the psychology of England that Tolkien sees, but also the universal psychology of the world, and that's why it's much closer to mythology. It's not psychologically accurate, but it's as in the edgy sense of that we try and make all of our modern stories. Like a Dostoevsky novel, those individuals are so psychologically accurate, but when you go to mythology, you get fantastic characters. You get larger than life characters who are heroes and who are villains, and it's very clean cut in some way, and the drama is something epic and unfurling, and it takes in the entire world, and it's all building to a pinnacle, to a peak, to an end, to a crescendo. And that's what Tolkien is creating, and you can kind of understand the stylistic choices and the nature of his mythology then, because he's trying to create some like high-minded mythology, a noble mythology, not a fantasy novel. And that's why he chooses the annalistic styles in the Silmarillion, or the more objective historical story, because it's been told at a later time. It's a historian writing those stories down, whereas The Lord of the Rings is them as they're happening. Well, I guess it could be the Red Book as well, but it's much more close because I guess it's written by the people. The Red Book would be written by the people who had the adventures, so it's a much more honest story in that way. It's much more normal novel, but it's still couched in this mythological world. And so I just wanted to, I guess, defend Tolkien a little bit there, because I feel like a lot of the criticism he gets comes from a misunderstanding of what he's trying to do. He's been put in the same bucket as fantasy authors when he's not doing exactly that. He's doing something slightly different, and in some way it's much, well, it's in every way it's much more ambitious, because he saw what he was doing as for the whole of England, and the languages he developed. Like he created these languages over decades, like Elvish and Dwarvish, and you can speak these languages, and he would create these languages, and then he'd think about the type of people that would speak them, and it's just the depth he put into that world building. And I know other authors put in a lot of work, but I don't think they see what they're doing as lofty or as ambitiously trying to create something that goes to the heart of a culture, that becomes a historical thing. And yeah, I just thought I'd clear that up. I hope you've enjoyed the episode today. If you have, please subscribe, and please give us a like. Love to hear from you down in the comments. Otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thanks for watching.